So good morning and welcome everyone to the University of East Anglia, where we're delighted to be hosting this week's conference on electoral reform, democratic principles and global practice. It's a 3-day workshop coordinated by the Electoral Integrity Project and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. My name's Toby James and I co-direct the Electoral Integrity Project and have been convening the workshop alongside Tanya Holstein from the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, but also colleagues Sophia Kaulam from the Electoral Integrity Project, Darko Alexov, who's in the room, and Sophie Young, who's also in the room from the University of East Anglia as well. And it's great to welcome you to sunny Norwich, and we hope very much one day to welcome you in person to UEA. You can kind of just about see it pictured behind me in the background, or to one of our other in-person events as well. So we've got a great lineup of papers to come in a moment, but before we go to those papers, I just wanted to give a relatively brief introduction to the conference as a whole and some of the puzzles and challenges and themes that we're going to try and unpick really together between us, between presenters, between discussants, between the audiences, and some of the questions that I think are particularly important. So, just to focus attention on some of these elements then. So, begin with just a very brief introduction to the Electoral Integrity Project. The Electoral Integrity Project was founded back in 2012 by Professor Pippa Norris at Harvard University and Sydney University, and has since then been trying to address a number of pressing policy problems and academic questions that have probably become all the more important since then. So the first is, what is the quality of elections around the world and how does that vary, for example, across the electoral cycle? How and when do elections empower people, and when do they disempower people? What are the consequences of failed elections for problems such as security, accessibility and trust? And maybe most importantly, what can be done to address these problems using academic evidence? How can we use that academic evidence to develop policy solutions? And the puzzle really that we're focusing on through these few days is electoral reform. So we know that election quality varies enormously around the world. It can vary from election to election, from country to country, from continent to continent. And so electoral reform is going to be a crucial part of how we address that. We need to develop new electoral laws to fix problems as and when that becomes apparent. But the problem then is, how do we go about making those electoral laws? How do we go about changing those electoral laws? Because this could be a very difficult pathway for democracy with lots of different traps along the way. So potentially rule makers will have their own entrenched interests about when they think about electoral reforms. Electoral reforms could be the problem. It could be that a would-be autocrat wants to go about trying to pick electoral reforms to make it easier for them to win at the next election. Governments might have other priorities. They might win office, come into power, they have the capability to introduce changes to elections, but suddenly maybe it's the economy, it's war, it's security, it's immigration, and suddenly important electoral reforms get dropped, or they drift from the agenda, or maybe don't really get the kind of scrutiny or public scrutiny that they deserve. Electoral reform could also quite easily turn into a big shouting match. There is increased political polarization in many societies where we might struggle to kind of come together to agree that this is the best course of action for everyone, and that these electoral reforms will strengthen democracy together. There's distrust amongst the public of political elites. So are we really going to trust political elites to devise electoral laws that are free and fair and help the public? Some of that mistrust well placed, some of it so less so, because we live in an era of disinformation as well. It's very easy for information to be spread around the world about the so-called motives of politicians. And likewise, it's easy to cast aspersions. Maybe good, well-meaning reformers want to improve the quality of elections, but actually, it's very easy for opponents to make cheap talk and to claim that they are trying to undertake reforms for their own interests. Now, there's been lots of research about electoral reform around the world, and this has been going on for many decades and maybe many centuries. But less about the actual process of electoral reform, how we introduce electoral reform. And so the Genocide Network, and we'll talk more about this shortly, in the second panel, have devised some principles which help us to think about how electoral reform could or should be conducted. Those principles will be unpacked in more detail in the second session, where Tanya Holstein will introduce those 6 ideas about consensus, transparency, inclusiveness, evidence, accountability, and appropriate timeframes. So importantly, this is not about which electoral reforms, this is about how we do electoral reforms together as a society. And so the questions that this project, these 3 days is addressing, come as follows. So what principles should underpin the electoral reform process? There's some potential answers here, but that you don't have to take these as read. Maybe there's some problems with these, maybe there's some gaps, maybe there's some things missing. So that's one theme of questions. The second is, to what extent are these principles actually followed around the world? When we look at Nigeria, when we look at Europe, when we look at the United Kingdom, we look at the USA, are these ideals that are never really in place, or actually are things actually much better? And consensus, for example, is often kind of formed. And then what are the barriers for these principles being met? So who gets in the way, or what gets in the way for these principles being followed? And then what are the consequences? Does it matter if we don't reach consensus? Does that have any noticeable effects on society? Does it affect trust, for example? Or is it okay to sort of not necessarily have consensus on electoral reforms if there's maybe some good evidence that electoral reforms are good? And maybe crucially, what principles can we follow in order to make sure that what can we do to make sure that the principles are followed? So we've got a great lineup over the course of 3 days. We start now with some thematic papers exploring some key topics related to the issue. In the second panel, Tanya Holstein will introduce the principles in more detail, and we'll have some speakers speaking about those. The remaining panels tend to then be focused on particular countries. So we'll look at, I'll introduce the United Kingdom, for example. To what extent were the principles followed there? We have speakers looking at the Netherlands and other countries too. Crucially, there'll be time for Q&A, and we really want your input from the audience to, are these principles along the right lines? Do they work? What are the problems? As ever, what we ask for is a really kind, respectful, constructive approach. We welcome constructive criticism over some of the ideas that are put forward. That's how ideas progress, but obviously in a supportive environment as well, which is very important to the Electoral Integrity Project and the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And on Friday, it's going to be a bit action-packed, but we're going to try and pull out some of the themes and some early conclusions and put that to the audience for feedback.